All right, we are back for another episode of the Productivity Show. My name is Tam Pham, founder and CEO of Asian Efficiency, where we help people become more productive at work and in life. And today, I'm joined by my co-host Brooks Duncan. How are you today, Brooks?
I'm excellent. Really excited to get into this topic because I think it's a really important one.
Yeah, today's topic is all about retrospectives. And before we start diving into today's content, one of the things we always like to do on the show is share some of our favorite resources as of lately. And this is especially true for this episode because it's all related to today's topic. So I'm going to share three here today. And the first one is a book called The Five Dysfunctions of the Team by Patrick Lencioni. And this is one of my favorite books. Personally, I always recommend it to everyone who joins our company. And it's almost like required reading in a way. And we revisit this topic or this book usually once a year because it's such a foundational piece to great teamwork, collaboration, and having a high performing team. So if you're looking and striving to having a high performing team or you want to be part of a high performing team, I definitely recommend you check out this book. The second resource is a website. It's scrumalliance.org. And again, we'll have links to all of this in the show notes. And this is kind of like the official website for being certified in Scrum. And Scrum is kind of like a project management philosophy or a philosophy of how you do things and work together. And you can get certified in that. And there's a lot of coaching and resources and workshops and lots of other things you can consume there. So go check out Scrum Alliance. And today's topic, retrospective, kind of comes from Scrum. So we're going to start diving deeper into that a little bit later as well. And speaking of Scrum, which is the third resource here, is a book called Scrum, The Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time. So there are a lot of Scrum books out there. And this is, in my opinion, one of the better introductory books on Scrum. So it's more of a kind of like a nonfiction book, and it's not as technical. So if you're new to Scrum or you want to dive deeper into Scrum and learn more about it, this is the book that I would always recommend to people to start off with before you start diving into the technical stuff. So again, we'll have links to all of this in the show notes. You can always go to theproductivityshow.com/370. So if you're made it this far and you're wondering, okay, what is a retrospective? It kind of sounds interesting. You know, you were listening to this, you were tapping on the listen button and you go, what the hell is a retrospective? Well, you are about to discover a new way of being more productive and effective. And I know some of you who are listening are already familiar with what a retrospective is, but maybe you've never done it before. So we're going to show you what to do. And also you can copy what works based on our experience. And I know many of you are also listening who already know what a retrospective is and maybe do it already at work or in your personal life. And I hope by listening to today's episode, you're going to pick up some advanced strategies as well to make them a little bit more effective. And Brooks, who is the guest of next week's episode?
Yeah, next episode, we have a guest coming up, which I'm really excited about because it's a question we get a lot on the Productivity Show. And so the guest is Isabelle Deveau, and she's going to be talking about photo decluttering. So going a completely different direction from today's episode, but we get a lot of questions about organizing photos, dealing with photos, digital photos, physical photos, that sort of thing. And she is somebody who does this as her business. So I really wanted to talk to her and get her insights into dealing with photos. So that's what we're going to be talking about next week, TPS371.
Awesome. So be sure to check out that episode. And Brooks, when it comes to retrospectives, what is a retrospective?
Yeah, we've mentioned Scrum a few times in this episode, but even if you're not somebody who kind of follows capital S Scrum, or frankly, even if you're somebody who is not deep on a team, you know, we're going to be talking about a lot of team stuff today, but the concept of what we're talking about is actually pretty simple. By retrospective, what we mean is carving out a bit of time in your schedule to basically reflect on the recent past, see what was successful and maybe see what was not so successful. A lot of times that's where the gold is. And it's really important because a lot of times we're always forward focused, right? We want to do new things. We want to try new things. We want to just do new. But really what really helps you get to that next level is to at least some of the time. I mean, the new is important, obviously, but a lot of times the reason you know what the new things to do are is when you take a little bit of time to look back at the past and see what you can improve. Because reflecting on things that didn't go so well, addressing those things instead of just like sticking with new things all the time, just leads to that growth. Is that what you've found, Tan?
I think another way to kind of like guide our listeners here on the power of a retrospective is to think about how if you just had to if you only had the option of removing annoyances in your life and anything that was inefficient and anything that bothered you, how much better and happier would you be? Right? If we just focus on doing that, like we've removed all the inefficiencies in your life, all the bottlenecks, anything that annoyed you, and not do anything else but that, how much better quality life would you have? How much happier would you be? My guess is you would be a lot happier, right? And this is by doing something that is oftentimes relatively simple, like fixing something that you're already doing and that makes you a little bit more efficient or effective or happier is oftentimes a lot easier than doing something completely new and different. And this is where the power of a retrospective kind of comes in, because when we spend some time thinking about what just happened and how can I tweak and make improvements and make things a little bit better, right? That is really powerful in itself. But most of us just don't spend any time doing this. And so I'm hoping by listening to today's episode, you really spend some time thinking about like, okay, I just finished a project, I just finished wrapping up with a client, or our team just was able to ship something, and to be able to sit down and say, okay, how can we repeat some of the successes that we had, which is, a retrospective thing to do as well. But also, what are some of the things that didn't go so well, right? And what are some of the things that maybe got delayed, and how can we address the root cause of that, right? And so I think it's really important for all of us to kind of like zoom out a little bit more often and reflect on what just happened before we start diving into the exciting, shiny object and doing all these different things.
Yeah, and it can be like a formal scheduled process, or it could be something kind of done informally when needed. But we really recommend formalizing as much as possible and having it on a schedule, having some sort of scheduled retrospective. Otherwise, you'll never find, like anything else in our life, you'll never find that you have time to do it, and it won't be as effective. But if you make it a regular thing that you do, then other things just kind of like go around it. The way we do it at Agent Efficiency is we basically formalize it as part of our sprints. So like we said earlier, we more or less follow the Scrum process, and there's a whole like infrastructure around that we won't really get into. We talked about it in detail in TPS 191. So you can go to theproductivityshow.com/191, where we go into detail about our process there. But basically how it works is we work in 2-week sprints, and every 2 weeks we have a meeting where we do what's called a review and a retrospective combined. This isn't like strict Scrum. Usually it's 2 separate things, but we kind of combine them. And a review is basically looking at the tasks that we've done, see what was done, and demo to the team so everybody kind of like knows what's new, and we can evaluate whether what we did was really what we should have been doing. So that's kind of like the review. And the retrospective is looking at what went well, what could have gone better, what changes to make, what surprises and lessons we learned. And that's where the real magic happens. So we kind of combine that into one meeting. And to keep it simple, we're going to talk about this whole process together as a retrospective, but it could be any or all of those things. Now, Tan, question for you. Let's say you're not part of a team. Let's say it's just, you're a freelancer, or you're maybe, you're on a team, but you can't really necessarily influence the way that your meetings of your organization work. Is a retrospective still something that you can do?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So let's say you're a consultant or a freelancer, you kind of are self-employed, right? The power of a retrospective is really powerful, even if you're not part of a team. Now, most of the time when you do some sort of digging or research on retrospectives, it's usually in a team setting, right? But you can also apply a lot of the ideas that we talked about today for your personal as well. This is something I do all the time. Like anytime I finish a trip, I run a personal retrospective as well and say, hey, what went well, what didn't go so well, and what could I do better next time? And that's why if you ever travel with me, it's oftentimes so smooth, but it took a lot of trips and retrospectives to kind of get really smooth and to the point where you don't have to worry about stuff. Everything has been covered. It's a reason why I have a checklist nowadays, because now I know, like, okay, last time I forgot something, I'm going to make sure I'm not going to forget this item again. So let's add it to the checklist. And you just make these little tweaks here and there to improve things. And so I'm a big believer of small, consistent changes done over time lead to major results. And that's really what a retrospective allows you to do, whether that's personal or in a team setting. Small, consistent changes over time lead to major results. And you'll see this idea in a lot of our courses. And in fact, it's one of our core values. It's Kaizen. It's the idea of continuous improvements, right? And so for me, I try to embody this as much as possible. And that's why we came up with the 3 times rule, right? If you've listened to that episode, we'll have to pull it up and we'll add it into the show notes as well. But we did an episode called the 3 times rule, which is all about the idea of if something happened to you 3 times or more, you probably want to address it at a root cause so it doesn't happen again, right? And that is kind of like a Kaizen mentality as well. But you can discover those things when you do a retrospective. And when you do them enough, you'll start to see the same patterns over and over again. So enough about retrospectives. Let's actually start diving into how to run a retrospective. So we have 3 tips for you here today to run a retrospective. So the first one is to allow your people to give feedback without blowback. Now, you can have the most structured process in place, but if the people on your team don't feel empowered or they don't feel that they can give honest feedback, then the retrospective is just not as powerful as it could be. It's just not that effective. So we want to make sure that everyone on the team feels comfortable providing and giving feedback. And so when you do this for the first time, it might actually be kind of like a slow and painful process to pull feedback from people and to get them to speak up and be able to share freely. And, I think we've all been in meetings where there's like 1 or 2 people that always dominate the conversation, right? And then there's others who don't say much at all and they just kind of follow along, right? That's not what we want to have when we do a retrospective. Ideally, when we run a retrospective, everyone speaks up because everyone has ideas, everyone has feedbacks, everyone has thoughts. And some people are a little bit more responsive than others. But when we can get everyone's feedback and capture it, then we have something to work with. And if we don't have that, then the power of retrospective goes down significantly.
Yeah, I think we've all been, especially those who have maybe worked in corporate, have all been in a situation where people are going into a meeting and they're all like talking about stuff. They're maybe complaining about this or that. They're talking about these issues, and then the meeting starts and nobody brings any of the things, any of the things that were talked about at the coffee room actually gets brought up in the meeting. And so that's where you want to get away from. And that's actually one of the reasons when we did our top 3 resources, we specifically wanted to mention the book by Patrick Lencioni, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And like Tan said, we'll have a link to that in the show notes because this is a really useful book for getting around these types of blocks if you have them in your team or your organization. And so the 5 dysfunctions that they talk about, it's actually done in a fable, but the 5 dysfunctions are absence of trust. So people aren't willing to be vulnerable within the group. There's also fear of conflict. So seeking artificial harmony, like everybody wants to get along, nobody wants to rock the book, or maybe lack of commitment. So everybody pretends to buy in. Everyone's like, oh yeah, that sounds good. But then everyone goes back to their desk and nothing happens. Avoidance of accountability. So people aren't willing to maybe call out their peers for things, or they don't want to be held accountable, and inattention to results. So people are focusing on their own success versus the success of the team and the organization. And so any of these, if there's glaring problems in any of those 5 dysfunctions, that can really make it difficult to run an effective retrospective. And that's why we wanted to list this as the first tip, because if you don't have the people issues, at least relatively sorted, then it's going to make the rest of the retrospective less useful, because it comes down to trust. If you're lacking some of these 5, you're not really going to have the full picture.
Yeah, if you're listening right now and maybe you are a Scrum Master or maybe you are someone who leads a team, but you find that the people don't hold each other accountable, you find that people aren't willing to speak up or are afraid of having their feedback be heard, I would highly recommend you check out this book, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team. Again, like I mentioned at the beginning, we go over this book once a year in our company to kind of revisit the ideas and see where are we lacking? Where can we be better as a team? Do we have fear of conflict? Do we have lack of commitment? Are we not holding each other accountable? And I think for us, the biggest struggle oftentimes is accountability. We want to make sure that we feel comfortable enough holding each other accountable. I think there's a lot of trust in our company. I think people aren't afraid of conflicts. I think people are generally pretty committed to what we're doing. And sometimes the accountability piece is a little challenging for some of us here. And we're all work in progress, and sometimes it's better done than others. But I think if you're leading a team, this is one of those books you just must read. Like I can't imagine anyone who leads a team or is in front of people not having read this book. It's really that powerful. So one other tip I want to share that I found really helpful is actually a quote by Norman Kurth, who is a Scrum coach. And one of the first things I said, both for our learning days, which is kind of like a super retrospective in a way. Like we have a learning day here at Asian Efficiency, which we do once a quarter. And we kind of look back at the past quarter and see what we could do better. And it's kind of like a retrospective, but on a quarterly basis instead of a sprint basis. And one of the things I put in there is this quote by Norman Kurth, which goes, regardless of what we discover, we must understand and truly believe that everyone did the best job he or she could, given what was known at the time, his or her skills and abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. And so what this means is that as we're going through the process of discovery of what went well, what didn't go so well, what could we do better, everyone did their best to their ability and the resources that they had and what they knew and so on, right? So we're not trying to point fingers. We're not trying to blame people. Everyone did their best. And if people feel that we have this safe space, it allows people then to step in and say, hey, yes, I messed up, or hey, I could have done this better, or hey, this person should have stepped up and done this, instead of just getting into blaming mode or feeling like we're being attacked or anything like that, right? So before we start that meeting, that's the quote I always like to bring up again and remind people, like, hey, this is a safe space. As we're going to go through this discovery process here, you did your best you could, right? And if we find something that's could have been better, let's talk about it, right? And knowing that it's not a personal attack.
Yeah, that's a great quote, because it can be hard to be the one receiving feedback. And like we said, it can be hard giving feedback, but having that reframe at the start really, really does help. I do want to give a shout out to our TPS Plus members. So TPS Plus is the special upgraded version of the productivity show. You get episodes a week early. You get episodes without ads. And if you're an annual member, which is actually our most popular plan, amazingly, that surprised me. But I think part of the reason why is because you get a t-shirt. So you get a 1 tweak a week t-shirt. You also get access to the actual show notes that Tan and I use when we, or Marmel, if she's here, when we record our podcast. So the documents that we look at as we go through this, you get access to those as well, which is kind of interesting sometimes because we make changes and a lot of people like having the podcast in written form. So we have that. All right, so let's do. Oh, and you can find out more about that at theproductivityshow.com/plus. That's an important part. All right. So tip number 2 is to make your retrospective structured with predefined questions. So the more structured you can make this, the more easy it makes it to be repeatable, and also the more useful feedback you're going to get. Because if you just ask the team, if you get the team together, either virtually or in person, and just say, oh, how is everything going? What did you think about the last 2 weeks? You're going to get, if you get any answers at all, they're going to be vague, they're going to be general, they're not going to be super specific usually. Or you're going to end up in the situation that we talked about earlier, where 1 or 2 vocal people are the ones that kind of dominate, that have stuff to say. So we recommend that you do it in a more structured way. So we thought it might be useful to share how we do it, which is basically when we have our retrospective meeting, we review our quarterly goals and where we are. We do what we call the review. That's what I talked about earlier, where we look at what we completed, We give demos to each other. In any changes that we need to make in the future, we record those for future sprints. We do the retrospective. So we ask a series of predefined questions, and then we share insights from each member of the team. Now, the way we do it is that insights are, people have the ability to share insights online beforehand on Confluence, which is the system that we use, so that no one's ever ambushed by feedback and nobody's ever kind of like put on the spot. Then we look ahead to the upcoming sprint, and then we do end what's called a roundtable of gratitude. Now, Tan, I mentioned that we go through a series of predefined questions. Maybe you can share what those questions are and kind of like what the thought process behind them is.
There are essentially 3 questions, and we added a 4th over time. But if I had to just boil it down, the 3 would be: what should we start doing? What should we stop doing? And what should we keep doing? And there's different variations of this, right? And like I mentioned earlier, what went well, what didn't go so well, what could we do better next time? Like, that's another variation. And it's really a matter of like which questions that you want to use. Okay. I would say that the one we use the most is the latter. What went well, what didn't go so well, what could we do better next time? Right. And then there's a 4th one you can add in, say, lessons learned, surprises, and observations. And when you start to run through these questions, you'll start to realize, oh, wow, like there's actually a lot of things that went well. Great. Let's celebrate those wins. Right. And then you go, what could we do or what didn't go so well? And you can go, oh, well, here's a laundry list of things that didn't go so well. And then you ask yourself, what could we do better next time? And some of that might be related to some of the things that didn't go so well. Some things are just tiny tweaks and improvements that you could be making for next time that would make the product or service or delivery of your team a little bit better or more efficient. And so if you allow your team to kind of add that feedback throughout the week, you'll start to capture a lot of great feedback. And when you oftentimes collect that feedback, what most of the times happens in most meetings is you collect the feedback, you talk about it, everyone agrees, and then nothing usually happens, right? So we want to make sure we avoid that. And this is where having action items is so important. So by the end of the retrospective, you want to make sure you are very clear what the next steps are going to be. It's one thing to collect the feedback, which is great, right? It's another thing to take it a step further and say, okay, now that we have this feedback, what are we going to do about this? How do we turn this into action steps or action plans? Or in personal terms, quote unquote, what's the next action, right? And sometimes there are multiple that you want to do. And so this is where our sprint model is kind of helpful, because we roll into the next sprint and we'll say, hey, based on what we just talked about, we need to make these 3 changes. And one of the things we have found is if we just introduce at most 3 changes or improvements, that's a great velocity and something that's realistic that we can do.
We record these episodes live in front of the Dojo, our productivity community, and TPS Plus. That's another benefit of the TPS Plus membership. And Dr. Tom in the live stream shares an interesting acronym, which I had never heard, which is KISS, which I think many of us have heard stand for one thing, but his wrinkle is KISS: keep, improve, start, stop. And I like that. That's a good way. Another way to spin this that I like. I thought it was pretty cool.
So Brooks, when it comes to retrospectives, what are some of the things that you have seen both internally and maybe in other companies that you think is really powerful about a retrospective and having the structured in there?
Well, like we mentioned, what I found really helpful is that it gives you something to go off of. It's not just a few people's opinions. It's not just the vocal people, but also it's not, once you walk out, like you said, once you walk out of the meeting, all the things that you talked about just kind of like disappear. It gives you a, because hopefully it's recorded somewhere. We do Confluence, but whatever you use in your team, it has that kind of like common base that people can then use from that meeting to apply those lessons learned and stuff like that to the stuff in the future. So that's what I found the most powerful, is just giving this common base to launch improvements off of, instead of just them happening kind of like willy-nilly or when people think of it.
All right, so that is tip number 2. Let's move on to tip number 3 here, and that is if it takes too long, simplify. Now, when you're first starting out, the meetings will take a really long time, and it might even feel a little bit frustrating or a little bit unproductive as you're trying to figure this out. And that's totally normal. That's part of the process as you're learning this. So to kind of give you a benchmark, most of our retrospectives are about 30 to 45 minutes. That's kind of like the benchmark we aim for. We could probably go for hours and hours and hours, but also we have had meetings where the retrospective was like less than 15 minutes. Like stuff like that will happen, right? It's not very common, but I would say if it goes over an hour, like it's probably too long. Okay. So that's kind of like something I would aim for, because you could have 8 team members, 10 team members, and you can talk about a lot of different things, right? And this is where kind of like the nuance of being a scrum master and a facilitator is helpful, or having some sort of training in that area to be able to facilitate that. But I would say no more than 60 minutes. And personally, we always aim for 45 at most. So if it takes too long, then you might want to consider to simplify your process. Okay. So if you had to boil it down, just ask the 3 questions we talked about earlier. What went well? What didn't go so well? What could we do better next time? Right. Or what should we start, keep, and stop doing? And so if you just boil it down to those 3, oftentimes you can fill up 30, 45 minutes very easily. Okay. When we first started off, we had a lot of different questions, and we had a lot of different sections of where we can make improvements, right? So for example, we have a board in Confluence where we had like different section areas. So we had like the team, we had procedures, we had technology, we had sprint management, we had priorities, and we had everything else. Like these were all different sections on a page where people could leave feedback behind. And by having that many sections, it allowed us to kind of like easily categorize where feedback belonged, but it also gave people a lot of reasons to like put more stuff in there sometimes. And it took us a longer time to go through it sometimes as well. And we were able to simplify this to just like really simple things and just say, hey, what went well, what didn't go so well, what could we do better next time? And that basically gives you the 80-20 of everything you would need to know anyway, right? So that's one way we kind of simplified it ourselves. And again, in my opinion, it shouldn't last more than 45 minutes.
Yeah, the having it really structured, like we've been saying, it's good to have it structured, but you can have it a little too structured. And by having all of those different prompts and categories, what ended up happening is when you're getting ready for the meeting, you're sitting there looking at the page and you're trying to come up with things for each category, right? You're like, oh, what are some technology things? What are some team things? And it ends up, like you said, it makes the meeting run longer. And then your people are spending their time trying to come up with things to share versus sharing what they find important in that moment. The interesting thing about this I wanted to mention is, like you said, we had all these prompts. We ended up shortening to just the 3 or 4 questions. And we actually realized this via the retrospective. It was when we were doing our retro, I think it was I think it was you, might have been Marmel, but one of you in this retrospective, when we were kind of looking at what we should start, stop, and keep doing, said, hey, we should maybe look at changing our retrospective and simplifying it. So it was in that retrospective, this is kind of like space-time continuum stuff, but it was in the retrospective meeting that we realized we needed to simplify the retrospective. And that's the power that it can have.
Yeah, so that is tip number 3. Again, if it takes too long, start simplifying. So we've made it to the end of today's episode. So if you made it this far, congratulations, you're amazing. And as always, we want to make sure that you leave this podcast with actionable steps. So one thing I would recommend you do is to run your first retrospective by answering the 3 questions we outlined today with your team or with yourself, and then schedule it on your calendar to go over with them or yourself as an experiment. Okay. So try it out as an experiment. You're not committed to doing anything more than doing it just one time, and just see how it goes. Okay. And I think you'll be surprised by the results when you do that. Next week's episode is all about photo decluttering with our guest, Isabelle Deveau. So be sure to check that out. Episode 371 is next week. And if you want to have access to everything that we talked about and mentioned today and have all the links, you can find all the show notes at theproductivityshow.com/370. Thanks for joining us here today, and we'll see you next Productive Monday.